The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows across the marble walls as servants whispered in hushed tones about what they had witnessed behind closed doors. The year was 548 AD, and in the heart of Constantinople, the most powerful woman in the Byzantine Empire lay dying. But this was no ordinary empress meeting her end. This was Theodora, a woman whose rise from the gutters to the imperial throne involved secrets so scandalous that historians buried them for centuries. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, corruption, and the lengths one woman would go to control an empire. Because Theodora's story isn't just about political ambition or religious devotion. It's about a calculated transformation that weaponized sexuality, manipulated entire populations, and created a shadow network of influence that reached into every corner of Byzantine society. If you're ready to uncover the truth about history's most controversial empress, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden stories from the past. And definitely let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because we're about to explore secrets that powerful people tried to erase from history forever. The entertainment district of Constantinople reeked of unwashed bodies and desperation. Street performers competed for copper coins while merchants hawked everything from stolen silk to watered wine. This was where our story begins, not in a palace or noble household, but in the basement chambers beneath the hippodrome, where a bear trainer named Acacius worked to feed his 3 young daughters. When Acacius died from an infected wound in 505 AD, his widow faced an impossible choice. Byzantine society offered few options for women with no family connections and no money. She could beg on the streets until starvation claimed them all, or she could parade her daughters before the racing factions that controlled Constantinople's entertainment industry, hoping someone would take pity on them. The scene that unfolded in the hippodrome that day would echo through history in ways no one could have imagined. The widow approached the Green faction first, the group that had employed her husband. They rejected her plea publicly, treating the family like diseased beggars. The Blues, their bitter rivals, accepted the woman and her daughters purely to insult the Greens. It was politics, not mercy, that saved them from the streets. Young Theodora was perhaps 5 years old when she learned her first lesson about power. It wasn't kindness or justice that determined survival. It was the ability to make yourself useful to people who had what you needed. The memory of that humiliation, standing before thousands of spectators while grown men decided her family's fate like they were betting on horse races, would fuel her ambitions for the rest of her life. By the time she reached 12, Theodora was performing in Constantinople's theatres, which served as barely disguised fronts for prostitution. The law made no distinction between actresses and courtesans because there effectively was none. Women who danced on stage also entertained paying customers in private rooms behind the theatres. Some performances happened publicly, with audiences paying to witness acts that pushed the boundaries of what Roman law technically permitted. The young girl who had once watched her mother beg for scraps quickly understood that her body was the only currency she possessed in a world that valued women solely for their ability to provide pleasure or produce children. But Theodora possessed something that set her apart from the other girls trapped in Constantinople's flesh trade. She had an extraordinary memory for faces, names, and conversations. While other performers focused only on satisfying immediate desires, Theodora was collecting information. Every senator who visited the theatres revealed his preferences and weaknesses. Every merchant who paid for private sessions exposed his financial dealings and family secrets. Every priest who abandoned his vows in darkened rooms demonstrated his hypocrisy and vulnerability. While these men thought they were consuming her services, Theodora was building a mental catalogue of leverage that would prove invaluable later. The performances themselves became increasingly elaborate and degrading as competition for wealthy patrons intensified. Historical accounts describe shows where young women would lie nearly naked on stage, while trained birds pecked grain scattered across their bodies. The audiences cheered as the performers writhed in apparent ecstasy, though anyone who understood theatre knew the reactions were carefully choreographed. Theodora excelled at these performances, not because she enjoyed them, but because she understood their psychological impact on the men watching. She could make any customer feel like he was the most important person in the room, while simultaneously memorizing every detail about his character, connections, and weaknesses. This skill would prove far more valuable than any physical attribute. The mathematical reality of her situation was staggering. Contemporary sources claim she could service dozens of men in a single evening, though these numbers were likely exaggerated by political enemies seeking to destroy her reputation decades later. What's certain is that her endurance and apparent enthusiasm quickly made her one of the most sought-after performers in Constantinople's entertainment district. But Theodora was playing a longer game than anyone realized. She began deliberately selecting clients based on their potential usefulness rather than their wealth. A poor clerk with access to government documents might receive her attention over a rich merchant with no political connections. She cultivated relationships with the wives and daughters of powerful families, making herself indispensable as both entertainment and confidant. The information she gathered wasn't just gossip. She learned which senators accepted bribes, which generals preferred young men to women, which bishops regularly violated their vows. She discovered the secret financial arrangements that kept the empire running, the family scandals that could destroy reputations, and the personal fetishes that could be used for blackmail. Knowledge became her real profession, while prostitution was merely the cover story. Her first major relationship was with Hecebolus, the governor of Pentapolis in North Africa. She convinced him to take her as his official mistress, escaping Constantinople's theatres for what seemed like a better life. For 4 years, she lived in relative luxury while continuing to study the empire's power structures from a privileged position. She learned how provincial governors extracted wealth from their territories, how they maintained loyalty among subordinates, and how they navigated the complex relationships between local elites and imperial authority. When Hecebolus abandoned her in Alexandria, leaving her penniless and thousands of miles from home, most women in her position would have returned to prostitution or died in poverty. Instead, Theodora did something unexpected that revealed the calculating intelligence beneath her performer's facade. She spent an entire year studying with Christian theologians, not out of genuine religious conviction, but because she recognized Christianity as the empire's rising power structure. She memorized scripture with the same dedication she had once applied to learning her clients' preferences. She studied theological debates with the intensity of a scholar preparing for advanced examinations. She cultivated relationships with influential bishops and abbots, presenting herself as a reformed sinner seeking redemption. The narrative of transformation from fallen woman to repentant Christian would prove invaluable when she returned to Constantinople. The journey back to the capital took her through multiple cities where she continued gathering intelligence about the empire's religious and political networks. She observed how different regions interpreted imperial law, how local elites maintained their positions, and how religious authorities wielded influence over civilian populations. By the time she reached Constantinople in 522 AD, she had transformed herself from a common prostitute into something far more dangerous. Officially, she supported herself through wool spinning and other respectable trades. Everyone knew this was largely fiction, but it provided the veneer of legitimacy she needed for her next move. Behind this facade, she was orchestrating one of history's most audacious seductions, targeting the most powerful unmarried man in the Byzantine Empire. Justinian was 40 years old, the adopted nephew of Emperor Justin, and widely considered the most likely heir to the throne. He was brilliant, obsessively studious, and completely inexperienced with women like Theodora. He spent his nights reading legal texts and theological treatises instead of visiting brothels or attending parties. This made him the perfect target for someone who understood exactly how to present herself to trigger his protective instincts while overwhelming his celibate defenses. The meeting wasn't accidental. Theodora had been planning it for months, using intermediaries who owed her favors from her theater days to arrange an introduction at a gathering Justinian shouldn't have attended. She knew his daily routines, his intellectual interests, and his psychological vulnerabilities. When they finally met, she was prepared to become exactly what he needed while he remained completely unaware of the game being played around him. The first encounter between Justinian and Theodora unfolded like a carefully orchestrated theatrical performance, except this time, the stakes weren't applause or coins. They were an empire. Justinian entered the private gathering, expecting a quiet evening of theological discussion among scholars. Instead, he found himself face to face with a woman who seemed to embody every contradiction the Byzantine world could produce. She was beautiful, but not in the obvious way of court ladies who relied on expensive cosmetics and imported silks. Her beauty came from intelligence that sparkled behind her eyes and a confidence that suggested she knew secrets about everyone in the room. Theodora had studied him for months before this moment. She knew he stayed awake until dawn reading legal manuscripts. She knew he had never taken a wife, despite pressure from his family. She knew he was fascinated by theological debates about the nature of Christ. She knew he was simultaneously the most powerful and most lonely man in Constantinople. Their conversation that evening revealed her extraordinary preparation. She could discuss complex theological questions with the sophistication of a trained scholar. She could quote legal precedents that impressed even Justinian's encyclopedic knowledge. She could speak multiple languages fluently and demonstrated familiarity with philosophical works that most educated men had never read. But beneath this intellectual display, she was performing something far more subtle. She presented herself as vulnerable enough to trigger his protective instincts while remaining mysterious enough to capture his imagination. She was the reformed sinner seeking redemption, the brilliant woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control, the diamond hidden in rough surroundings that only someone with his wisdom could recognize. Within weeks, Justinian was visiting her constantly. Within months, he was talking about marriage. This created a political crisis that threatened to topple the government. Roman law explicitly forbade senators from marrying actresses or former prostitutes. The prohibition wasn't just social custom, but legal bedrock that had existed for centuries. The contamination was considered permanent and hereditary. Once a woman had performed on stage or sold her body, she could never be purified enough to marry into the senatorial class. Justinian's desire to marry Theodora wasn't merely scandalous gossip for court entertainment. It was legally impossible under existing law. The empire's entire social structure depended on maintaining clear distinctions between respectable families and those tainted by dishonorable professions. The Empress Euphemia, Justin's wife and Justinian's adopted mother, blocked the union with fury that revealed how much she understood about Theodora's true nature. Euphemia knew exactly who this woman was and what she represented. Everyone in Constantinople's elite circles knew about the bearkeeper's daughter who had performed with trained geese. Everyone remembered the stories about her theatrical specialties and private services. The prospect of this creature wearing imperial purple while Euphemia drew breath was absolutely unthinkable. She marshaled every resource at her disposal to prevent what she saw as the ultimate degradation of imperial dignity. Theodora waited with the patience of someone who had learned to survive through careful calculation rather than emotional outbursts. She made no public demands or dramatic gestures. Instead, she positioned herself as the victim of outdated laws and unfair prejudice. She cultivated allies among court women, many of whom had their own complicated histories they preferred to keep buried. Her public image transformation during this period was masterful. She donated generously to churches where everyone could observe her devotion. She attended religious services where her piety was visible to hundreds of witnesses. She supported charities that helped reformed prostitutes, presenting herself as someone who understood their struggles through personal experience. Every appearance was calculated to reinforce the narrative of redemption. The former sinner had found salvation and deserved the chance to prove her transformation through marriage to a righteous man. The performance was so convincing that even people who knew her history began to believe in her genuine conversion. Euphemia's death in 524 AD removed the final obstacle to Theodora's ambitions. Within a year, Justinian had convinced his uncle to change the fundamental law of the empire. The new legislation was written in careful legal language, but everyone understood its true purpose. The empire's legal code was being rewritten to allow one specific woman to marry one specific man. The law supposedly applied to all reformed actresses who demonstrated genuine repentance, but no one was fooled. This was imperial legislation with a single beneficiary. Theodora had achieved something unprecedented in Roman history. She had forced an empire to change its most basic social laws to accommodate her personal desires. The wedding ceremony in 525 AD was designed to overwhelm any remaining opposition through sheer spectacular display. Theodora wore purple silk worth more than entire provinces, jewels that had been collected from across the known world, and a crown that proclaimed her transformation from gutter performer to imperial consort. She entered the Hagia Sophia as a reformed sinner seeking God's blessing. She emerged as the future empress of the most powerful empire on earth. The symbolism was lost on no one. The woman who had once stripped naked for copper coins now wore colours that only emperors were permitted to display. When Justin died in 527 AD, Justinian became emperor with Theodora as his co-ruler. Not merely empress consort in the traditional sense, but Augusta, wielding power that equaled his own in many areas. She received foreign ambassadors independently, issued edicts with her personal seal, and maintained a separate court with its own budget and staff. No woman in Roman history had ever wielded such official authority. But according to whispered rumours that began circulating almost immediately, her unofficial activities were even more extraordinary than her public role. The palace underwent extensive modifications after 527 AD that couldn't be explained by normal imperial needs. Construction records show the addition of specialised chambers, underground passages, and architectural features that served no obvious governmental purpose. These weren't renovations of existing structures, but entirely new construction designed for purposes that weren't specified in official documents. Secret passages were built that allowed visitors to reach Theodora's private quarters without being observed by regular palace staff. The construction was sophisticated enough to include sound dampening that prevented conversations from being overheard, and ventilation systems that prevented distinctive odours from spreading to other areas of the palace. The roster of men who received private audiences with the empress began raising questions among court observers. Generals who had been struggling in their careers suddenly received prestigious commands. Bishops who had been assigned to remote parishes found themselves elevated to wealthy urban positions. Foreign ambassadors, who had been making little progress in their negotiations, suddenly achieved remarkable diplomatic breakthroughs. What all these men had in common were extended private meetings with Theodora that lasted far longer than any official business would require. They would enter her chambers in the afternoon and emerge hours later, looking simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. Their subsequent behaviour suggested they had been fundamentally changed by whatever had transpired behind those closed doors. The most notorious case involved a young aristocrat named Ariobindus, who was married to Justinian's niece. He began visiting Theodora's chambers 3 times weekly for nearly 2 years. His wife noticed dramatic changes in his behaviour and energy levels, but when she questioned him about these regular appointments, He claimed they involved confidential imperial business that he couldn't discuss. When Ariobindus finally attempted to end these visits, claiming he needed to focus on his family responsibilities, he was suddenly accused of treason against the empire. He fled to a monastery seeking sanctuary, but was dragged back to Constantinople by imperial guards. He was never seen alive again. His wife was informed that he had died of sudden illness, though no body was ever produced for burial. These disappearances became a pattern that court observers began to notice but never dared discuss openly. Men who had been regular visitors to Theodora's private chambers would sometimes vanish entirely from public life. Their families would be told they had been reassigned to distant provinces or had died from natural causes. But the explanations never quite made sense. The architectural modifications to Theodora's wing of the palace became increasingly elaborate and mysterious. Workers who had been involved in the construction were systematically transferred to frontier fortifications, where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. The building plans themselves disappeared from imperial archives, leaving no official record of what had been created. Ifications warically transfer systemat, fort-lifed to frontier expect in months rather than years. The building themselves' disappearancy was measure imperial plans from record of what archived, leaving no official had been created. The servants who survived their employment in Theodora's wing spoke in whispers about modifications that defied explanation. Pools with underwater seating carved to support bodies in positions that normal anatomy couldn't naturally maintain. Chambers with mounting points built into walls that served no architectural purpose anyone could identify. Heating systems that maintained specific temperatures in different rooms, creating environments that made clothing uncomfortable even during Constantinople's coldest winters. The most disturbing reports came from workers who had installed mirror systems throughout her private chambers. Polished silver surfaces were positioned to create infinite reflections, multiplying images endlessly in every direction. The psychological impact of these installations suggested purposes that went far beyond simple vanity or decoration. Medical records from palace physicians during this period contain cryptic references to treating injuries that couldn't be explained through normal imperial activities. Torn tissue, suggesting extreme physical stress, bruising in patterns that indicated prolonged restraint, and damage from what appeared to be mechanical devices rather than human contact. The physicians documented these cases in coded language, understanding that explicit descriptions could cost them their lives. The procurement network that supplied Theodora's private activities reached across the known world. Merchants in Alexandria provided substances that enhanced physical endurance and altered consciousness. Traders from India brought carved implements made from ivory and precious stones that served purposes Roman medicine couldn't comprehend. Persian suppliers delivered oils and unguents with properties that could transform normal sensations into something approaching religious ecstasy. These exotic imports were hidden within legitimate palace supply shipments, disguised as medical supplies or religious artifacts. The true nature of these items was known only to a select group of servants who had been chosen for their absolute loyalty and their inability to speak about what they witnessed. The transformation of Constantinople's social dynamics during Theodora's reign reflected her influence in ways that historians have struggled to explain. Senators who had once commanded respect through birthright and wealth suddenly found themselves dependent on the favor of a woman they had previously dismissed as worthless entertainment. The psychological reversal was profound and permanent. Marcus Antonius, a senator whose family had held prestigious positions for generations, discovered this new reality when he attempted to oppose one of Theodora's religious policies. Within days of his public criticism, he received a private package containing detailed documentation of his visits to certain establishments during his youth. The records included dates, specific services requested, and amounts paid, all described in language that left nothing to imagination. Marcus immediately withdrew his opposition and became one of Theodora's most vocal supporters in the Senate. His transformation from critic to advocate happened so quickly that other senators understood the message without needing explicit threats. The Empress possessed information that could destroy anyone who challenged her, and she was prepared to use it without hesitation. The religious establishment faced similar pressures. Bishop Anthemius of Constantinople owed his elevation entirely to Theodora's support. She had promoted him from obscurity despite his questionable theology and even more questionable personal habits. In exchange, he provided religious justification for her activities while condemning anyone who questioned her moral authority. When senators raised concerns about palace morality, Anthemius would preach about the dangers of bearing false witness. When rumors spread about the empress's private behavior, he would deliver sermons condemning gossip as a mortal sin. The pulpit became Theodora's public relations platform, transforming criticism into religious offense. The theological debates that Theodora hosted were performances of intellectual sophistication designed to establish her credentials as a serious Christian thinker. She would summon bishops and scholars to discuss the nature of Christ, the interpretation of Scripture, and the requirements for salvation. These discussions demonstrated her encyclopedic knowledge of religious texts and her ability to argue complex doctrinal points. But the timing of these theological gatherings raised questions among observant court members. They often preceded or followed activities in her private chambers that seemed to contradict every principle being discussed. The woman who could quote Scripture for hours would then retire to rooms where activities occurred that violated every religious teaching she had just defended. The monastery network that received Theodora's generous patronage served multiple purposes beyond religious devotion. The monastery of St. Simeon in Syria was rebuilt entirely with her donations after an earthquake. The abbot, a man named Severus, who had fled Orthodox persecution, wrote letters of gratitude that bordered on worship. He called her a new Mary, God's chosen vessel, holier than the ancient saints. But Severus also supplied Theodora with young novices who were transferred to Constantinople for what he described as special theological training. These young men would disappear into the palace complex and were never seen again. Their families were told they had been selected for sacred duties that required complete separation from worldly concerns. The convent of St. Catherine in Alexandria operated under similar arrangements. The abbess, Maria, had been a performer in Constantinople before finding religion, which meant she understood exactly who her patron was and what was expected in exchange for protection and funding. When Theodora requested pure vessels for holy work, Maria knew to send her most attractive young nuns. These religious establishments became recruitment centers disguised as charitable institutions. Women who had nowhere else to turn were offered food, shelter, and protection in exchange for services that weren't specified until after they had become dependent on palace support. By then, refusing meant returning to streets where survival was unlikely. The elimination methods that Theodora employed for dealing with inconvenient witnesses or potential threats combined Byzantine sophistication with techniques learned in Constantinople's underground world. The architect Anthemius of Tralles designed more than just the Hagia Sophia's revolutionary dome. He created chambers in the palace where the atmosphere could be gradually altered, pools with hidden mechanisms that could exhaust even strong swimmers, and floors that could open into shafts leading to underground waterways. Senator Photius discovered these innovations when he attempted to blackmail Theodora with evidence of her continued activities. He had somehow acquired documents, possibly stolen by a servant, that detailed specific gatherings and their participants. He requested a private audience to discuss matters of mutual financial interest, confident he was about to become extremely wealthy. The meeting took place in one of Theodora's reception rooms, beautifully appointed with silk cushions and Syrian wine. Photius presented his evidence while she listened with apparent amusement. She offered him wine, which he accepted eagerly while calculating his demands. She suggested they continue their discussion in more private surroundings, where they wouldn't be interrupted. The wine contained a paralytic agent derived from plants that grew only in remote Indian valleys. The substance was slow-acting, but irreversible, causing gradual loss of motor function while leaving consciousness completely intact. As Phoedius negotiated his blackmail terms, his extremities began to tingle. By the time he realized something was wrong, he could no longer move his legs. Theodora continued their conversation as if nothing unusual was happening, discussing payment schedules while he progressively lost all ability to move. When he could only communicate with his eyes, she explained his situation with clinical detachment. He would be listed as having departed Constantinople on urgent business. His family would receive forged letters in his handwriting explaining his extended absence. Meanwhile, he would remain in a specialized wing of the palace, completely paralyzed but fully conscious, maintained alive by servants who had been surgically prevented from speaking. Through windows, he would watch life continue without him while being unable to communicate his circumstances to anyone. He survived 3 years in this condition before finally dying of what appeared to be natural causes. The actress Macedonia had been Theodora's rival during their theatre days, competing for the same wealthy patrons and the same prestigious performances. She made the error of returning to Constantinople years later, assuming old rivalries had been forgotten. She was welcomed warmly and invited to a private dinner to reminisce about their shared past. She left that dinner fundamentally changed in ways that weren't immediately apparent. Theodora maintained physicians who could perform modifications that affected sensation without visible damage. Macedonia discovered over the following weeks that she could no longer experience physical pleasure of any kind. Nerve pathways had been severed with surgical precision that left her functional but unable to feel touch, taste, or any form of physical satisfaction. For someone who had lived entirely through her body's capacity for sensation, this was a fate worse than death. She survived 20 more years, unable to experience any of the pleasures that had once defined her existence. The cruelty was precise and permanent, demonstrating Theodora's understanding of what would cause the maximum psychological damage to this particular victim. Bishop Constantine had opposed Theodora's theological positions too vigorously, calling her interpretations heretical in what he believed was private correspondence. He was invited to the palace for theological debate, an honor that seemed to recognize his scholarly credentials. During their discussion, he was offered refreshments as a gesture of imperial hospitality. The next morning, he discovered his voice had been transformed into a high, ridiculous squeak that made his sermons sound like comedy performances. Palace physicians could find no medical explanation for the change. He spent his remaining years unable to preach without audiences dissolving into laughter, his authority completely destroyed by a modification that left him physically unharmed but professionally ruined. These eliminations followed patterns that revealed Theodora's systematic approach to removing threats. She didn't simply kill enemies, which would have created martyrs and raised questions. Instead, she neutralized them through methods that appeared natural, accidental, or self-inflicted. Each victim's fate was carefully calibrated to their specific vulnerabilities and the message she wanted to send to potential future problems. The record-keeping for these operations was meticulous, but disguised within routine palace administration. Hidden throughout the archives were documents that appeared to track medical treatments, building maintenance, and staff assignments. Someone who knew the code would recognize a comprehensive catalogue of sophisticated elimination techniques, but casual observers would see only bureaucratic efficiency. The financial infrastructure supporting these activities was equally sophisticated. Theodora maintained secret accounts throughout the empire, funded through various mechanisms that left no obvious trails. Confiscated property from eliminated enemies provided substantial resources. Percentages from businesses that enjoyed her protection created steady income streams. Tribute from foreign rulers who preferred her friendship to her enmity added to her private treasury. This shadow economy funded not only her elimination operations, but also the architectural modifications, the procurement networks, and the maintenance of her intelligence apparatus. The woman who had once counted copper coins for performing with trained animals now controlled financial resources that rivaled the imperial treasury itself. The intelligence network that Theodora constructed during her reign operated with a sophistication that wouldn't be matched by European powers for another millennium. While historians focus on her public achievements and scandals, the true extent of her shadow apparatus remained hidden until archaeological discoveries in the 20th century began revealing the physical infrastructure she had created. The foundation of her network rested on an understanding she had developed during her theatre days. Information was more valuable than gold, and the people nobody noticed possessed the most dangerous secrets. Servants who cleaned senatorial bedrooms heard everything their masters discussed. Kitchen staff who prepared meals for government officials learned about military campaigns before generals received their orders. Prostitutes who serviced bureaucrats discovered which policies were being debated behind closed doors. Theodora systematically recruited these invisible people, transforming them from passive observers into active intelligence gatherers. A serving girl in a senator's household might receive a small gift of jewelry that cost more than her annual wages. A bath attendant at the Imperial Gymnasium would find extra coins in his purse after reporting on conversations he had overheard. The network grew through gratitude and fear in equal measure. The eunuchs formed another crucial layer of her intelligence apparatus. These castrated men occupied a unique position in Byzantine society, trusted with access to women because they posed no sexual threat, but dismissed by men as incomplete and therefore harmless. Theodora cultivated them with the patience of someone who understood their psychological needs for recognition and respect. Narses, her chief eunuch, commanded armies and controlled vast territories while reporting everything to his empress. Scholasticus managed the palace financial records while maintaining detailed accounts of who received payments for undisclosed services. Each eunuch in her network supervised dozens of subordinates, creating cells that couldn't be fully exposed even if individual members were discovered. The information these networks provided was intensely personal and immediately useful. Senator Strategius preferred very young partners, a weakness Theodora exploited by providing carefully selected companions who reported every confession whispered during intimate moments. Bishop Severus had developed an expensive taste for Syrian wines that loosened his tongue about church politics and theological disputes. General Bowsers talked in his sleep, revealing military strategies to the courtesan Theodora had placed in his bed. The blackmail materials were catalogued with bureaucratic precision that would impress modern intelligence agencies. Hidden chambers throughout the palace contained documents that could destroy anyone in Constantinople, letters proving financial corruption, testimony about sexual preferences that would horrify the public, evidence of religious violations that could result in execution. Theodora didn't always use this information immediately. Sometimes she held compromising materials for years, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy them. Marcus the patrician learned about her patience when he opposed one of her theological positions in 538. The next morning, his wife received an anonymous package containing detailed accounts of his visits to a specialized brothel that catered to men with particular appetites involving multiple young partners. The documentation included specific dates, exact payments, and descriptions of activities that left nothing to imagination. Marcus withdrew his opposition immediately and became Theodora's most enthusiastic supporter in future debates. The network extended far beyond Constantinople's boundaries through correspondence with noble women across the known world. These weren't merely diplomatic pleasantries exchanged between royal courts. The letters contained coded intelligence about military movements, succession disputes, and economic vulnerabilities that would prove invaluable for imperial policy decisions. The barbarian queen Amalasuntha thought she was confiding in a sympathetic friend about her troubles with Gothic nobles who questioned her authority. She was actually providing detailed intelligence that Justinian would later use to justify his invasion of Italy. The Persian ambassador Zamasp discovered the network's international reach when he attempted to negotiate a secret treaty with dissident Byzantine generals. Within hours of their clandestine meeting, Theodora knew every detail of the proposed arrangement. She didn't expose the conspiracy immediately, allowing it to develop while gathering names of every participant. Then, at a public banquet attended by foreign dignitaries, she casually mentioned details that only the conspirators could have known. Watching their faces change as they realized their exposure was complete provided her with visible satisfaction. The generals involved in the plot were arrested that same night. Zamasp was sent back to Persia, carrying a message that Theodora's intelligence capabilities reached into the heart of enemy territories. The demonstration served multiple purposes, eliminating immediate threats while warning other potential conspirators about the futility of opposing her. Religious institutions provided unexpected sources of intelligence throughout the empire. Theodora funded monastic communities that followed Monophysite doctrine, particularly those in remote locations where local governors felt free to speak openly about imperial policies. Monks and nuns, grateful for her protection from orthodox persecution, reported on everything from grain harvests to tax collection irregularities. A monastery in Syria might inform her about Arab tribal movements along the frontier. A convent in Egypt would report unusual activities among Alexandria's merchant community. These religious communities became listening posts disguised as charitable institutions, gathering information that helped the imperial government anticipate problems before they became crises. The sexual intelligence Theodora collected was perhaps the most valuable category in her files. She maintained detailed records of who was sleeping with whom throughout Constantinople's elite circles. She knew which senators' wives were conducting affairs, which bishops were violating their vows nightly, which generals preferred male companions to female ones. This wasn't moral crusading, but practical statecraft. A senator couldn't effectively oppose her policies if she possessed evidence that would destroy his marriage and social standing. A general couldn't organize military resistance if she could expose preferences that would alienate his troops. The threat of revelation was often more powerful than actual blackmail, creating an atmosphere where self-censorship became the norm among potential opponents. The procurement network she established for acquiring human resources was particularly sophisticated. When Theodora needed someone eliminated or compromised, she could provide exactly the right temptation tailored to their specific psychological vulnerabilities. The austere judge who had ruled against her interests would suddenly encounter someone who matched his precise physical preferences and could engage him in conversations about his intellectual passions. The seduction would unfold over weeks or months, building genuine emotional attachment before revealing the true purpose. By then, the target would be so emotionally invested that refusing cooperation seemed impossible. The judge would begin reversing previous decisions to maintain access to his new obsession, never realizing that every word he spoke was being reported directly to the Empress. Children formed another layer of her intelligence network through the orphanages she established throughout Constantinople. These institutions rescued genuine street orphans while serving as recruitment centers for future operatives. The children received education and training that prepared them for placement in households where they could prove useful. A boy might become a secretary to a prominent senator, gaining access to all correspondence and financial records. A girl could be placed as a lady's maid to the wife of a military commander, observing family dynamics and overhearing private conversations. These children owed their survival to Theodora's intervention, creating loyalty that extended beyond normal employer relationships. The architectural intelligence embedded in Constantinople's rebuilding after the Nika riots demonstrated her long-term strategic thinking. During reconstruction, her architects included features designed for surveillance rather than aesthetics. Hollow columns carried sound from rooms above to listening posts below. Decorative grillwork that appeared purely ornamental actually allowed observation of private activities. Floor gaps that seemed like minor construction flaws permitted conversations to filter through to recording chambers. The rebuilt Constantinople became a city designed for intelligence gathering. with Theodora positioned at the center of multiple information flows. Foreign rulers gradually learned to fear her reach into their own territories. The Vandal King. Gelimer discovered that she had been corresponding with his wife for years when negotiations revealed intimate details about their marriage that could only have come from private conversations. The Frankish king Theudebert found that Theodora knew about his invasion plans before his own generals had received their orders. The Gothic king Totila received letters containing information about his supporters that could only have originated from within his inner circle. Her intelligence network had achieved something unprecedented in ancient warfare: the ability to predict enemy actions through systematic penetration of their decision-making processes. The financial mechanisms supporting this vast intelligence apparatus were hidden within legitimate imperial expenditures. Palace construction budgets included payments for specialized architectural features whose true purposes weren't specified in official records. Medical supply purchases covered exotic substances that served purposes Roman physicians couldn't comprehend. Religious donations funded monasteries that operated as intelligence stations rather than purely spiritual institutions. The former actress Chrissa Mallow, now married to a senator, managed Theodora's most sensitive operations with the skill of someone who understood both court politics and street survival. She coordinated the placement of operatives in strategic positions throughout the empire. She managed the procurement of specific resources for the Empress's private activities. When problems arose that required permanent solutions, she ensured they were handled with efficiency that left no traces. Her house near the palace became known among informed circles as a place where certain types of business could be conducted discreetly. People would enter for meetings that seemed routine, but some never emerged. Neighbors learned not to ask questions about the unusual activities they occasionally witnessed after dark. The medical intelligence that Theodora's network provided gave her unprecedented advantages in predicting political developments. Her physicians didn't merely treat illnesses among the imperial family. They maintained detailed records of health conditions affecting senators, generals, and other key figures throughout the government. She could anticipate succession crises, military leadership changes, and policy shifts based on medical information that nobody knew she possessed. When Senator Hypatius began showing signs of the wasting disease that would eventually kill him, Theodora started cultivating relationships with potential successors months before his condition became publicly apparent. When General Belisarius developed vision problems that affected his battlefield effectiveness, she had already identified replacement commanders and begun testing their loyalty. The psychological profiles her operatives compiled went far beyond simple blackmail material. They included detailed analyses of personality traits, emotional vulnerabilities, and behavioral patterns that allowed her to predict how individuals would react to specific pressures. This information enabled her to manipulate enemies and allies with precision that seemed almost supernatural to those who experienced it. The transformation of Byzantine court culture during Theodora's reign reflected her systematic influence over social dynamics. Ancient protocols that had governed senatorial behavior for centuries were subtly altered to create opportunities for intelligence gathering. Seating arrangements at imperial banquets placed potential opponents next to operatives who could monitor their conversations. Gift-giving customs were modified to include items that served surveillance purposes. The traditional Roman toga was gradually replaced by more elaborate garments that required assistants to wear properly, creating opportunities for servants to access private areas where documents might be hidden. Even religious ceremonies were adjusted to include rituals that provided cover for passing information between operatives. The palace staff during Theodora's reign included an unusually high proportion of people with disabilities that prevented normal communication. Servants who were naturally mute or had been surgically silenced maintained the most sensitive areas of her private quarters. Workers who were blind from birth handled documents that could never be read by unauthorized eyes. The Empress had created a household where the most dangerous secrets were protected by people who physically couldn't reveal them. This systematic approach to intelligence gathering and control created a shadow government that operated parallel to official imperial administration. While Justinian governed through law and bureaucracy, Theodora controlled outcomes through information and manipulation. Her network could influence elections, determine military appointments, and shape religious policies without leaving obvious traces of intervention. The scope of her operations became apparent only after her death, when the careful systems she had established began revealing their true extent. Documents hidden throughout the palace complex contained evidence of activities that had shaped imperial policy for decades. Architectural features that had seemed merely decorative were revealed as sophisticated surveillance equipment. Financial records showed payments for services that had never been officially acknowledged. The servants who had survived employment in her private quarters spoke cautiously about modifications to the palace that defied conventional explanation. They described mechanical devices imported from distant lands that served purposes nobody wanted to discuss publicly. They mentioned chambers where the laws of physics seemed temporarily suspended through engineering techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. The medical records from palace physicians contained references to treatments that suggested activities far removed from normal imperial duties, injuries that couldn't be explained through ceremonial functions or administrative work, physical modifications performed on healthy individuals for reasons that weren't medically justified, substance abuse patterns that indicated regular exposure to exotic drugs that enhanced sensation while eliminating inhibition. These fragments of evidence painted a picture of imperial power exercised through methods that combined political sophistication with appetites that challenged contemporary understanding of human behavior. The woman who had risen from Constantinople's entertainment district to the throne had never abandoned the skills that enabled her initial survival. She had simply applied them on a scale that transformed an empire. The systematic control Theodora exercised over Constantinople's religious establishment revealed the true sophistication of her political manipulation. While maintaining her public image as a devout Christian who attended daily liturgy at the Hagia Sophia, she was simultaneously orchestrating a shadow religious network that served purposes far removed from spiritual devotion. Her support for monophysite Christianity wasn't driven by theological conviction, but by strategic necessity. The monophysites were a persecuted minority who desperately needed powerful protection. In exchange for her patronage, they provided absolute loyalty that couldn't be purchased through normal political channels. Bishops who owed their survival to her intervention wouldn't question her private activities because they couldn't afford to lose her protection. The monastery of St. Simeon in Syria became a model for how she transformed religious institutions into intelligence assets. After an earthquake destroyed the original buildings, Theodora funded complete reconstruction, with donations that exceeded the monastery's previous value by thousands of %. The grateful abbot, Severus, wrote letters praising her as a new Virgin Mary, describing her holiness in terms that bordered on worship. But Severus also began supplying Theodora with young novices, who were ostensibly being transferred to Constantinople for advanced theological training. These promising young monks would disappear into the palace complex and were never seen again. When their families inquired about their progress, they were told the young men had been selected for sacred duties requiring complete separation from worldly concerns. The convent of St. Catherine in Alexandria operated under similar arrangements. The abbess Maria had worked in Constantinople's entertainment district before finding religion, which meant she understood exactly who her benefactor was and what might be expected in return for generous funding. When Theodora requested pure vessels for holy work, Maria knew to select her most attractive young nuns for transfer to the capital. These religious establishments became recruitment centers disguised as charitable institutions. Women who had nowhere else to turn were offered food, shelter, and protection in exchange for services that weren't fully explained until after they had become completely dependent on palace support. By then, refusing meant returning to streets where survival was unlikely and starvation was certain. The theological debates Theodora hosted were elaborate performances designed to establish her credentials as a serious Christian intellectual. She would summon bishops and renowned scholars to discuss complex doctrinal questions about the nature of Christ, the proper interpretation of Scripture, and the requirements for achieving salvation. These discussions would continue for hours, with Theodora demonstrating encyclopedic knowledge of patristic writings and the ability to argue sophisticated theological positions. But the timing of these scholarly gatherings raised questions among observant court members. They often immediately preceded or followed activities in her private chambers that seemed to violate every religious principle she had just defended with such eloquence. The woman who could quote scripture for hours would then retire to rooms where events occurred that contradicted every Christian teaching she had articulated. Her personal confessor, a priest named John, who owed his position entirely to her influence, heard the secrets of Constantinople's elite during what were supposed to be confidential religious consultations. The sanctity of confession meant nothing when the empress's political interests were at stake. Senators who confessed to adultery would mysteriously find their wives receiving anonymous letters detailing their infidelities. Generals who admitted to embezzlement would face sudden financial audits that exposed every irregularity in their accounts. The confessional booth had been transformed into an intelligence-gathering station, with religious authority providing cover for systematic invasion of privacy. The priest who should have been protecting penitents' secrets was instead reporting everything to the woman who controlled his career and possibly his life. The religious art Theodora commissioned contained hidden meanings that were visible only to those who knew what to look for. The famous mosaic depicting her in the Hagia Sophia shows her holding what appears to be a communion chalice, officially representing Christian devotion. But the gems decorating the chalice are arranged in patterns that correspond to astronomical configurations used in pre-Christian mystery religions. The folds of her robes in various religious artworks contain symbols that predate Christianity by centuries. She was embedding pagan imagery within Christian art, hiding forbidden knowledge in plain sight while maintaining her public reputation for orthodox piety. The artists who created these works understood the dual messages they were encoding, creating religious art that simultaneously served as instruction manuals for practices the Church officially condemned. The monasteries she established in remote mountain locations served purposes that extended far beyond prayer and contemplation. The monastery of Mount Bithynia, accessible only through a single treacherous mountain path, became a destination where certain problems could be permanently resolved. Individuals who had witnessed too much, participated in too much, or learned too much would be sent there for spiritual reflection and never return to the outside world. The monks who operated these isolated communities maintained strict vows of silence that prevented them from discussing their permanent residence with outside authorities. Families were told that their relatives had chosen lives of complete religious dedication that required severing all worldly connections. The remote locations made verification impossible, and the religious justification discouraged further questioning. Her theological writings, praised by contemporary scholars for their sophisticated analysis of Christian doctrine, contained coded messages that could be interpreted entirely differently by readers who possessed the proper knowledge. Passages discussing the unity of divine nature could also be read as instructions for achieving physical unity between human bodies in specific configurations. Discussions of spiritual ecstasy described techniques that had nothing whatsoever to do with prayer or meditation. She had created religious texts that functioned simultaneously as orthodox Christian theology and as detailed instruction manuals for practices that would horrify any legitimate Christian authority. The double meaning was so skillfully embedded that casual readers would see only pious devotion, while initiates would recognize comprehensive guidance for activities that violated every moral principle Christianity taught. The feast days she instituted followed patterns that revealed their true purposes to anyone who understood her actual intentions. She established religious celebrations that required overnight vigils, providing cover of darkness for activities that couldn't be conducted during daylight hours. She instituted fasting periods that involved specific dietary restrictions, which coincidentally enhanced physical sensitivity and lowered psychological inhibitions. She scheduled religious festivals that brought particular types of people to Constantinople at times that proved convenient for her private purposes. Pilgrims seeking spiritual fulfillment would find themselves diverted to audiences with the Empress that had nothing to do with religious devotion and everything to do with satisfying appetites that defied conventional description. The hospital she established for reformed prostitutes wasn't merely an act of Christian charity, but a sophisticated recruitment operation. Women who had literally nowhere else to go were provided food, shelter, and medical care in exchange for services that weren't specified until they had recovered their health and become dependent on continued palace support. By the time these women understood what was actually expected of them, refusing meant returning to streets where survival was impossible. The choice between starvation and compliance wasn't really a choice at all. The Empress had created a system that trapped desperate women through false promises of redemption, then exploited their desperation to maintain a steady supply of participants for activities that required constant replacement of personnel. The orphanages followed similar patterns of deception disguised as charity. Children rescued from genuine starvation were provided education and training that prepared them for futures they hadn't chosen. Most received legitimate instruction and were eventually placed in respectable households where they could build normal lives. But some children, those who possessed particular physical characteristics or demonstrated specific talents, were directed toward different destinies. By the time they understood what was expected of them, they were too psychologically dependent on palace protection to refuse participation in scenarios that reminded them exactly why they had needed rescue from the streets. The elimination methods Theodora employed for managing inconvenient witnesses combined Byzantine technological sophistication with psychological techniques she had learned during her years in Constantinople's underground entertainment world. The palace architect Anthemius of Tralles, famous for designing the Hagia Sophia's revolutionary dome, also created specialized chambers where atmospheric conditions could be gradually altered to produce specific effects on human physiology. He constructed pools with hidden mechanisms that could exhaust even exceptionally strong swimmers through currents that appeared natural, but were actually artificially generated. He designed floors that could open into concealed shafts, leading to underground waterways that carried bodies far from the palace before depositing them in locations where discovery was unlikely. These architectural innovations allowed for eliminations that appeared accidental rather than intentional, avoiding the creation of martyrs or the raising of uncomfortable questions about palace security. Each method was calibrated to the specific individual being eliminated, ensuring that their disappearance would seem consistent with their known habits and psychological tendencies. Senator Photius discovered these innovations when he attempted to blackmail Theodora with documents he had somehow acquired that detailed specific gatherings and their participants. Confident he was about to become extraordinarily wealthy, he requested a private audience to discuss what he termed matters of mutual financial interest. The meeting began cordially in one of her reception chambers, with Photius presenting his evidence while Theodora listened with apparent amusement. She offered him wine from her personal collection, which he accepted eagerly while mentally calculating his demands. When she suggested continuing their discussion in more private surroundings, he followed willingly, already imagining the luxurious lifestyle his blackmail would finance. The wine contained a paralytic compound derived from plants that grew only in remote Indian valleys, a substance that caused gradual loss of motor function while leaving consciousness completely intact. As Photius continued negotiating his extortion terms, his extremities began experiencing unusual sensations. By the time he realized something was seriously wrong, he could no longer control his legs. Theodora maintained their conversation as if nothing unusual was occurring, discussing payment schedules while he progressively lost all ability to move. When he could communicate only through eye movements, she explained his situation with clinical detachment. He would be officially listed as having departed Constantinople on urgent imperial business. His family would receive letters forged in his handwriting, explaining his extended absence on sensitive government matters. Meanwhile, he would remain in a specialized section of the palace, completely paralyzed but fully conscious, kept alive by servants who had been surgically prevented from speaking about their duties. Through carefully positioned windows, he would observe life continuing without him, while being unable to communicate his circumstances to anyone who might provide assistance. He survived 3 years in this condition, watching seasons change through his window, while his body remained completely motionless before finally succumbing to what palace physicians recorded as natural causes related to prolonged illness. His family mourned a man they believed had died serving the empire in distant territories, never knowing he had actually perished within sight of the palace where they occasionally attended court functions. The actress Macedonia had been Theodora's primary rival during their shared years in Constantinople's entertainment district, competing for the same wealthy patrons and the most prestigious performance opportunities. She made the fatal error of returning to the capital years later, assuming that old professional rivalries had been forgotten in the wake of Theodora's remarkable transformation. She was welcomed with apparent warmth and invited to an intimate dinner, where they could reminisce about their shared experiences in the theatre world. The evening proceeded pleasantly, with both women sharing stories about their former colleagues and laughing about the absurdities of their previous profession. Macedonia left that dinner fundamentally altered in ways that weren't immediately apparent, but became horrifyingly clear over subsequent weeks. Theodora maintained a staff of physicians who could perform surgical modifications that affected neurological function without leaving visible evidence of intervention. Macedonia gradually discovered that she could no longer experience physical pleasure of any kind. Nerve pathways had been severed with surgical precision that left her completely functional in every obvious way, while eliminating her capacity for physical sensation. For someone who had lived entirely through her body's ability to provide and receive pleasure, this represented a fate considerably worse than simple death. She survived 20 more years, unable to experience any of the tactile pleasures that had once defined her existence, serving as a living reminder to others in Constantinople's entertainment community about the consequences of competing with someone who had achieved ultimate power. The modification was so precisely executed that no physician could identify its cause, making her condition seem like divine punishment rather than human intervention. Bishop Constantine had opposed Theodora's theological interpretations too vigorously, publicly calling her positions heretical in correspondence he believed was completely private. He was invited to the palace for theological debate, an honor that seemed to recognize his scholarly credentials and provide an opportunity for intellectual discussion between equals. During their extensive conversation about Christian doctrine, he was offered refreshments as a gesture of imperial hospitality. The discussion continued for hours, with both participants demonstrating impressive knowledge of scripture and patristic writings. Constantine left the palace feeling satisfied that he had presented his theological positions effectively. The following morning, he discovered that his voice had been transformed into a high, ridiculous squeak that made his sermons sound like comedy performances rather than serious religious instruction. Palace physicians examined him thoroughly, but could identify no medical explanation for the dramatic change in his vocal characteristics. He spent his remaining years unable to preach without congregations dissolving into uncontrollable laughter, his religious authority completely destroyed by a modification that left him physically unharmed but professionally ruined. The psychological impact of his transformation served as a warning to other religious leaders about the dangers of opposing the empress's theological positions too openly. These systematic eliminations followed patterns that revealed Theodora's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and her strategic approach to neutralizing threats. Rather than simply killing enemies, which would have created martyrs and raised uncomfortable questions, she neutralized them through methods that appeared natural, accidental, or self-inflicted. Each victim's fate was carefully calibrated to their specific vulnerabilities and the message she wanted to communicate to other potential problems. The eliminations served multiple purposes simultaneously, removing immediate threats while educating observers about the futility of opposing her will. The record-keeping for these operations was maintained with bureaucratic precision but disguised within routine palace administration. Documents scattered throughout the imperial archives appeared to track medical treatments, building maintenance, and staff assignments. Someone who understood the coding system would recognize a comprehensive catalogue of elimination techniques, but casual observers would see only evidence of efficient governmental organization. The financial mechanisms supporting these activities were hidden within legitimate imperial expenditures through accounting methods that distributed costs across multiple budget categories. Palace construction included payments for architectural features whose true purposes weren't specified in official documentation. Medical supply purchases covered exotic substances that served purposes Roman physicians couldn't begin to comprehend. Religious donations funded monasteries that operated as elimination centers rather than purely spiritual institutions. Charitable contributions supported orphanages that functioned as recruitment facilities for future operatives. The shadow economy Theodora had constructed was so thoroughly integrated with legitimate imperial finances that separating sanctioned activities from personal operations would have been virtually impossible. The former actress Chrysomallo, now married to a prominent senator, managed Theodora's most sensitive operations with skills that combined court political awareness with street survival instincts. She coordinated the placement of operatives in strategic positions throughout the empire, while maintaining the social facade expected of a senatorial wife. She supervised the procurement of specialized resources for the Empress's private activities, ensuring that unusual requirements were met through supply chains that left no traceable connections to the palace. When problems arose that required permanent resolution, she arranged solutions with efficiency that eliminated all evidence of palace involvement. Her residence near the imperial complex became known among informed circles as a location where certain types of sensitive business could be conducted with complete discretion. Visitors would arrive for meetings that appeared routine, but some individuals never emerged from these consultations. Neighbors learned to avoid asking questions about the unusual activities they occasionally witnessed during nighttime hours. The medical intelligence that Theodora's network provided gave her unprecedented advantages in predicting political developments before they became apparent to other observers. Her physicians didn't merely treat illnesses affecting the imperial family. They maintained detailed records of health conditions affecting senators, generals, and other key governmental figures throughout the empire. She could anticipate succession crises, military leadership changes, and policy shifts months in advance based on medical information that nobody realized she possessed. When Senator Hypatius began showing early symptoms of the wasting disease that would eventually prove fatal, Theodora started cultivating relationships with his potential successors before his condition became publicly apparent. When General Belisarius developed vision problems that would affect his battlefield effectiveness, she had already identified replacement commanders and begun testing their loyalty to her personal interests. The medical intelligence provided her with a form of prophecy that seemed almost supernatural to those who experienced its effects. The psychological profiles her operatives compiled extended far beyond simple blackmail material, to include comprehensive analyses of personality traits, emotional vulnerabilities, and behavioral patterns that allowed her to predict individual reactions to specific pressures with remarkable accuracy. This information enabled her to manipulate both enemies and allies with precision that appeared almost magical to those who found themselves responding to her influence in ways they couldn't explain. The transformation of Byzantine court culture during Theodora's reign reflected her systematic influence over social dynamics that had governed aristocratic behavior for centuries. Ancient protocols were subtly modified to create opportunities for intelligence gathering that seemed like natural evolution of ceremonial traditions. Seating arrangements at imperial banquets were adjusted to place potential opponents next to operatives who could monitor their conversations while appearing to engage in normal social interaction. Gift-giving customs were altered to include items that served surveillance purposes while maintaining their appearance as generous imperial largesse. The traditional Roman clothing styles were gradually replaced by more elaborate garments that required assistance to wear properly, creating opportunities for specially trained servants to access private areas where documents might be concealed or conversations overheard. Even religious ceremonies were modified to include rituals that provided cover for information exchange between network operatives. The palace staff during Theodora's reign included an unusually high proportion of individuals with physical characteristics that prevented normal communication about their duties. Servants who were naturally mute or had been surgically silenced maintained the most sensitive areas of her private quarters. Workers who had been blind from birth handled documents that could never be read by unauthorized personnel. The Empress had systematically created a household where the most dangerous secrets were protected by people who were physically incapable of revealing them to outside authorities. This approach ensured that even if palace security was somehow compromised, the most critical information would remain protected by the biological limitations of those who possessed access to it. This systematic approach to intelligence gathering and control established a shadow government that operated alongside official imperial administration with devastating efficiency. While Justinian governed through established legal frameworks and traditional bureaucratic channels, Theodora wielded power through information networks and psychological manipulation that could influence any outcome she desired. Her operatives had infiltrated every level of Byzantine society so thoroughly that she could predict political developments before they occurred, manipulate economic policies through strategic blackmail, and eliminate threats before they fully materialized. The scope of her influence became apparent only decades after her death, when investigators began discovering the true extent of the system she had constructed. Documents hidden throughout Constantinople revealed activities that had shaped imperial policy for generations. Architectural features that had seemed merely decorative were exposed as sophisticated surveillance equipment capable of monitoring private conversations across multiple buildings. Financial records showed payments for services that had never been officially acknowledged, creating a parallel economy that funded operations the government couldn't openly support. The servants who survived employment in her private quarters spoke cautiously about modifications to the palace complex that challenged conventional understanding of engineering capabilities. They described mechanical devices imported from distant civilizations that served purposes nobody wanted to discuss publicly. They mentioned chambers where normal physical limitations seemed temporarily suspended through technological innovations that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. Medical records from palace physicians contained references to treatments that suggested activities far removed from standard imperial duties, injuries that couldn't be explained through ceremonial functions or administrative responsibilities. Physical modifications performed on healthy individuals for reasons that served no identifiable medical purpose. Patterns of substance use that indicated regular exposure to exotic compounds designed to enhance sensation while eliminating psychological inhibition. These fragmentary pieces of evidence painted a picture of imperial power exercised through methods that combined political sophistication with appetites that pushed the boundaries of contemporary understanding about human behavior. The woman who had risen from Constantinople's entertainment districts had never abandoned the survival skills that enabled her initial escape from poverty. She had simply refined those techniques and applied them on a scale that transformed the fundamental nature of how empires functioned. The religious establishments under her patronage served as recruitment centers for a network that extended across 3 continents. Young people who entered these institutions seeking spiritual salvation often found themselves redirected toward entirely different forms of service. The monasteries and convents that received her generous donations understood that certain expectations accompanied her financial support, though these requirements were never explicitly documented in official correspondence. The empress, who had once performed naked with trained geese, died wearing purple silk worth more than kingdoms, her transformation from Constantinople's gutters to the Byzantine throne complete. But even in death, Theodora remained dangerous. The servants who prepared her body discovered marks that shouldn't exist on a faithful wife, found correspondence that revealed appetites her court historians called inhuman, uncovered evidence of a shadow empire built on systematic manipulation, elimination, and desires that required architectural modifications to accommodate. History tried to bury her secrets, but DNA studies reveal the truth. Modern populations across Europe carry genetic markers that trace back to the systematic trafficking networks she controlled. The legal codes Justinian created with her influence still shape Western law today. Churches she funded to maintain her religious facade still stand across 3 continents. The intelligence techniques she pioneered wouldn't be matched for another 1,000 years. Theodora won the ultimate victory. She died as Augusta, not actress. The Orthodox Church venerates her as a saint, despite the life she actually lived. Museums display her mosaic in the Hagia Sophia as the perfect image of Christian devotion, while hiding the archaeological evidence that tells a different story. The bearkeeper's daughter, who learned her body was currency, purchased an empire with it, then spent decades proving that power, once seized through any means necessary, could be maintained through methods that made her initial sins look innocent. She remains history's most successful contradiction, the prostitute saint who never reformed, the faithful wife who maintained networks of lovers, the protector of women who systematically exploited them. Every piece of purple silk traded in medieval markets whispered her name. Every emperor who wore that color carried her memory. She had conquered not just Byzantium, but the very symbol of imperial authority itself. If you want to discover more shocking truths that powerful people tried to erase from history, that video appearing on your screen reveals another chapter they hoped would stay buried forever. Hit that subscribe button because there are countless more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and these forgotten voices deserve to be heard.